This is the Reason interview with Nick Gillespie. Thanks for listening. I've got a great guest for you today, one who will absolutely knock your socks off, I think. But first, let me ask you to please subscribe to this podcast, The Reason Interview with Nick Gillespie, at Apple, Google, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts, or go to reason.com/podcasts. And while you're there, check out Reason's other programs too. They include the Reason Roundtable, a rollicking discussion and shoutfest about the week's biggest stories. That includes me, Matt Welch, Peter Suderman, and Catherine Mangu-Ward. And there's also the Soho Forum Debates, the audio version of the monthly Oxford-style debates we sponsor in New York City every month. Two smart people slug it out before a live audience over issues such as cryptocurrency, immigration, abortion, privacy, drug legalization, prostitution, and the future of work. It's good stuff. Please subscribe to The Reason Interview with Nick Gillespie, The Reason Roundtable, and the Soho Forum Debates at reason.com/podcasts. Okay, on to today's show, which is all about Titania McGrath, the fiercest social justice warrior on Twitter. Titania, we'll find out how to pronounce her name in just a second. She writes from London and burst onto social media in 2018. She describes herself as, quote, a radical intersectionalist poet committed to feminism, social justice, and armed peaceful protest, end quote. She also identifies as non-binary, polyracial, and ecosexual, and claims to, and I quote, teabag the foes of justice with a gender-neutral scrotum, end quote. She is the author, most recently, of the new book, Woke, A Guide to Social Justice, which is filled with such insights as there are now more Nazis living in modern Britain than even existed in 1930s Germany, and say what you will about ISIS, but at least they're not Islamophobic. As you might have surmised, Titania McGrath is, of course, not a real person, but a spoof brilliantly pulled off by today's actual podcast guest, Andrew Doyle. Doyle is a writer and comedian whose work has appeared on the BBC, at the Fringe Festival in Scotland, and he writes regularly at Spike.com, the heterodox site edited by friend of Reason, Brendan O'Neill. Doyle says he created Titania to spoof identity politics, which he says is, quote, a collectivist ideology. It does not value an individual for the content of his or her character, but instead makes prejudicial assessments on the basis of race, gender, and sexuality. In the name of anti-racism, he continues, identity politics has rehabilitated racial thinking. Wow. We're going to talk about that. We're going to read some very funny lines from Titania McGrath's Woke, and we're going to discuss how we might get past this current moment of ultra-politically correct insanity. Andrew Doyle, thanks for talking to Reason.
Thank you for having me.
Let's talk about Titania first.
Okay.
And then I do want to talk about your I don't want to say your real writing, because Titania is realer than real, but stuff that you put out under your own byline, because you're, I think, a really exceptionally thoughtful, smart observer of the current moment, you know, whether in England or Europe and North America. So we'll get to that. Okay. And I apologize for being so fawning and complimentary.
Never apologize for that. Okay. I can't have enough compliments.
But Titania, and is that
Titania? Yeah, so as in the character from A Midsummer Night's Dream.
That's right. And she, of course, refers to Shakespeare as, what is her gloss on Shakespeare?
Well, she just considers him a dead white male and therefore not worthy of consideration.
Right. And who played around in Moorish patois for the play Othello.
That's right. Yes, that's you know my book better than I do.
So, and this is, I mean, what is she's 24 years old, right, Titania? And it is just one of the things that I have to stress to people, if you're not following Titania McGrath on Twitter, and she's got like 400,000 followers, you have to. The detail of the kind of mind thought that you get from her is just hilarious, because she's mistaking just the way Shakespeare wrote for Moorish patois.
Because she can't understand it.
Yeah.
So she assumes she's speaking like a black man, because she's basically a bit racist as well.
Well, so she comes from a posh background, but she sees herself as a victim. At one point in the book, she complains about being breastfed as a child by her mother, despite being a vegan. She says, when my mother breastfed me for 6 months, even though I was a vegan. How important is victimization to the Titania McGrath mindset?
It's essential. It's essential because she absolutely thrives on it in the way that the people I would call the identitarian left, the people on the left who have subscribed wholesale to this kind of identity politics, they seek out victimhood and cherish it like it's some sort of badge of honor.
Why is that? I mean, I think you're essentially right, and certainly, I mean, that's much of the humor is that Titania, is extremely privileged and yet is constantly talking about being
that's what's funny about I find those sorts of people funny because someone who has been raised in an independently wealthy family who has had such privilege throughout their life to complain about their victimhood is just funny to me,
right?
And that's part of the reason why I wanted to do that. But,
so where does that come from?
Right, I don't know, but it's a very good question. I suppose there's always, I think most of us can understand the allure of being the victim. I'm thinking back to, do you know Quentin Crisp?
Yes.
Right. So Quentin,
the naked civil servant.
The naked civil servant. And of course, he ended up living here, didn't he?
Yes, he did. And absolutely.
He said in one interview, I remember him saying, all I really ever wanted was to be a chronic invalid. And I think what he was saying is, he just wants to be looked after, and there is something alluring about it, but I mean, it is something that we should resist, I think, insofar as it's not good for any of us to be victims or to embrace victimhood. I mean, did you see the other day, 2 days ago, I think Daniel Kaluuya, the actor, saying in an interview that he doesn't consider himself a victim and that he wishes people would stop going on about his race. He says that I am.
I'm sorry, Daniel
he's in, Kaluuya. He's in. I might be mispronouncing his name, which would be terrible, but I don't know how to pronounce it. He was in Get Out.
Okay, you're right.
And he's rather brilliant.
Yeah,
actually.
He's a great actor.
But he said in this interview he doesn't. He's not denying how important his race is to him or his racial identity, but he's saying, I wish people would stop going on about it and seeing me as a victim. I don't think of myself as a victim, and that's really refreshing.
That is, it's interesting that he's in Get Out. Jordan Peele, the auteur behind that, as well as us, who is mixed race. Key and Peele, I mean, they became huge in America for a Comedy Central show, a sketch show, and they're both mixed race, and they really go after both, white racism, but also then, certain tropes within black identity. Also, Get Out in a way is a story about victimization and lingering race, but it's also a kind of satire on that.
Yeah, it is.
Well.
I really enjoyed it.
Yeah. Well, and this raises his second movie, and I realize we're kind of pulling away from Titania, but it's all mixed. No, Us is a story about class ultimately, because there's a black family that's at the at the center of the movie, but ultimately it's about class.
Yeah.
You, in various writing, you talk about how, when I was going to grad school in the 80s and the mid 90s, race, class, and gender were the big, that was the holy trinity.
Yeah.
It is, you have written elsewhere about how kind of class falls away in this.
It has done.
Why does that?
I think largely, it's a big question, but and for me to reduce it to something quite simple, which is what I'm about to do, I think largely it comes from where all of this stuff comes from, which is the postmodern thinkers of the 60s and 70s, who did explicitly replace the notions of money, economic privilege, with identity concerns surrounding race, gender, sexuality, and power structures.
Right. So you're saying that obviously a Marxist analysis or a Marxian analysis is based on class.
Yes,
it's based on
exactly.
economics.
But they took that element away.
In the same, there's a fantastic book which I literally, and I mean that I take it seriously, and I think it's really powerful, and it's also incredibly dated. There was a book in the early 70s called The Dialectic of Sex by a feminist named Shulamith Firestone, and she literally replaced a Marxist analysis where she takes out class and puts in gender.
Yeah, I think when lots of people talk about dismissively of cultural Marxism, of the idea of, but to be fair, the post-structuralists and the postmodernists did claim to be following a Marxist template in what they were doing, and I think. And I, in addition to that, it won't have escaped anyone's attention that the most prominent vocal voices on the identitarian left and the social justice movement are very privileged people. They tend to come from that kind of bourgeois background. So I suspect that's why class doesn't figure highly in their list of priorities, because of course they've never really had to struggle for anything financially.
And it also, class is a tougher kind of category. It's inherently unstable.
It's also harder to solve. Like actually sorting out economic inequality is tough.
Yeah.
Supporting gay marriage is easy.
Right.
Putting a gay rainbow flag on your Twitter profile is easy. But actually redressing economic inequality it takes effort.
Right. And I was going to say, I know from a previous conversation we've had, we're both Monty Python fans. There's the Dennis Moore sketch where Dennis Moore is a Robin Hood type figure, and he steals from the poor and gives to the rich, stupid bitch or whatever. But he as people give them his lupins. Yeah. But then he's constantly redistributing wealth, and the minute you get something, then you're rich, and he has to steal it from you and give it away again. So it's like it's a much more unstable kind of category.
It's really hard, and I think we saw this recently in the UK. So much of the sort of identitarian politics became sort of attached to the Brexit debate, and through that whole process, it has now become fairly normal amongst left-wing circles to utterly demonize working class people and to not have any redress for it in a way that
this gets very confusing though too. Is it right to say that working class people were more in favor of Brexit?
Overwhelmingly.
Okay, because in America and Brexit and the rise of Trump kind of get wedded together, even though
it doesn't make any sense.
And Trump lost. Hillary Clinton overwhelmingly won voters from households in families making less than $50,000. She won the poor vote, or the working class vote. But what is going on that leftists in Britain, and I interviewed Billy Bragg, about 6 months ago or so, and we got along well when talking about music and kind of hating hippies. But one of the things I didn't understand, he had in his book, he was talking about the need to, that global capitalism was bad because it was remote, and, people in distant economic centers, Paris, Amsterdam, the US, whatever, were dictating things, through economic systems of exploitation. But then he was fiercely anti-Brexit.
Yes.
Like, what's going on?
It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense to me, for anyone who self-identifies as a socialist, to suddenly support this neoliberal trading bloc known as the EU. I mean, this is one of the reasons why I supported Brexit, is that I can't possibly reconcile a genuinely left-wing perspective with that. It doesn't work.
If it was Moscow or St. Petersburg or the Kremlin calling the shots, maybe you could, right? In an earlier iteration. Where there was that dream of, from a socialist point of view, through a good chunk of the Cold War, of an international struggle.
Of course, the internationalist thing is, but this is a totally different thing. I mean, let's look at what the EU is and how it operates and how pro-corporate it is. I mean, we saw that with the secret meetings about the transatlantic trade investment partnership that were going on without our knowledge, because everything happens behind closed doors at the EU, and we have no means to get rid of these people. We don't elect them, and therefore we can't get rid of them. And this is one of the things that Tony Benn, the great socialist, always said, is that one of the most important questions is, how do we get rid of the people in power? We should have a mechanism by which we can do that. This is fundamental to left-wing politics. So to answer your question, I think what happened was a kind of collusion between the media and prominent celebrity figures meant that the Brexit debate got reframed as a question of race and racism. And therefore, it was seen that if you voted in favor of the EU, you had this more sort of open-minded international view. You were for freedom of movement, etc., and therefore you were anti-racist. And then if you voted in favor of Brexit, you must be a racist and you want closed borders. The irony of all of this is that so many of the EU's policies are borderline racist. I mean, they're all they're fine with freedom of movement so long as it's white people within their borders. But you try getting in from the subcontinent or Africa, I mean, this is why there are so many deaths in the Mediterranean. It was a lie. The idea that the Brexit vote was based on your attitudes toward racism was a flagrant lie perpetuated by the media. We know from the EU's own studies that we live in probably the most racially tolerant country in Europe. Certainly, we are the most racially tolerant major country in Europe. And so I think it was the reframing of the debate that led to people to misunderstand what the debate was really about.
Let me, to bring it back to Titania McGrath's Woke, here is a quote, and I'm going to run through a couple of quotes that I find very funny, and then I want to ask you some questions about this. But on this question of racism, Titania writes, "It is not racist to hate someone on the basis of their skin color if that person is white."
Yes, and she's since developed this idea that actually, if you are a person of color, but you share a platform with a white person, that makes you white adjacent.
And that's problematic.
And now she's saying she would never share a platform with a person of color because by doing so, that person of color must be racist for agreeing to share a platform with her.
And she also notes at one point that it's only since I've retransitioned to white that I've managed to revitalize my love of Enya.
Yeah, she loves Enya now. Yeah, that's right. Because Enya is such an irredeemably white figure. But Irish, so she's got some oppression elements there.
I guess so. How does that work in the great constellation these days of kind of identity politics in the UK? I mean, being Irish in the US, we can talk about that in a little bit.
Oh, that's interesting.
Because there's, I mean, one of the great things, and obviously I am, my father's was Irish, my family on his side was Irish. You're of Irish descent. England has pilfered, or Great Britain has always, I mean, the secret of it is that it takes Irish people, and then when they're great artists, it says they're British, and when they're criminals, they say, oh, this is they're irredeemably Irish.
That's actually a good
right?
strategy. That's quite
But does
smart.
Being Irish count for anything anymore?
Not really.
In today's England?
I mean, it should do in a way, because of course, if you go back to the 60s when there were sort of signs on doors saying no Irish,
right?
I mean, it was definitely, but it doesn't count for anything because we're just so pale. Like genetically, we're very pallid.
Yes,
we sunburn very easily.
And it's a very gingery thing. And
well, my grandmother was ginger.
Is not a fan of the gingers, right?
No, she says in the book that they should be treated like normal people, but she doesn't trust them. I think because there's a kind of inveterate whiteness about ginger people. In
the chapter called Towards an Intersectional Socialist Utopia, she writes, class is something of a distraction from the real issues. If the social justice movement has taught us anything, it's that sexuality, gender, and race are far more likely to affect your potential for social mobility than economic circumstances, education, or nepotism.
Yeah, I think that's what a lot of them believe. And that's one of the things that I think if we want a serious revitalization of a left-wing movement, it has to be class-based, ultimately.
So how would that work, though? And
this is a point I've made before, but I think it's an important one. So to give the example of the obsession we have, particularly in the media, about identity politics. If you take some company like the BBC, broadcaster like the BBC, and the BBC have recently been advertising internships for non-whites only, right? And what happens in that scenario is you end up with a lot of privileged people from ethnic minority backgrounds taking those roles. It doesn't actually help ethnic minority people from a poor background. So what I suggested was that, if you do believe in quotas, why not just have a quota which says 7% of the BBC need to be, only 7% are privately educated, because that's the number in the country that are privately educated. And that way you would solve all your other issues of racial parity and gender and sexuality, and everything else would be sorted. But it would mean that we would also have class parity. But they don't want to do that. There's no way that would even be entertained, because it would involve firing an awful lot of people at the BBC, because even though only 7% of our country are educated privately, they predominate in the media and the arts and journalism and law and government and you name it, So I think in terms of if you're serious about equality, but you're not serious about class equality, then actually you're not serious about equality.
Titania writes, I have always felt a profound connection with people of color. Perhaps it's because when I was growing up, most of our staff were Filipinos. How do you come up with things like that? How do you get into the mindset of a social justice warrior?
It's because I know so many of them, I think, and I read so much of their stuff. I like when I was writing that book, for instance, I went away to an island to write it, and I took a lot of books with me, books by people like Rennie Edo-Lodge and Laurie Penny and Afua Hirsch. And so
could you talk a little bit about them, because they're less well known in the
Sure, they're probably not known here. Okay, so they're the kind of left-wing, they write for publications like The Guardian or The New Statesman, which are very sort of left-leaning, well, not really left-leaning, but identitarian. They're books about victimhood. They're books, I mean, Afua Hirsch is a great example. She grew up in one of the most wealthy backgrounds you could imagine, independent millionaire, grew up in Wimbledon of all places. In her book, British-ish in brackets, in parentheses, she talks about growing up as a child, going on sort of, she describes it as berry-stained rambles on Wimbledon Common. And she talks about skiing in the Alps, holidays skiing. We never went abroad as a child. We couldn't afford that. So the idea of this obviously pampered, privileged woman, but the whole book is about how how much of a victim she is because she's mixed race. And whilst I have absolutely no doubt that it's possible for a mixed race person to face racism and that is a bad thing, if you come from a millionaire background, my sympathy is limited, not because of racism, but because of your privilege. I think you're a very privileged person, and that should be acknowledged. But it's so easy to elide class issues when it comes to this stuff. And I think it's quite vulgar, actually, a millionaire complaining about their oppression. I could just consider that very vulgar.
So there's a class dimension to your critique of the woke crowd. There's also, embedded in Titania is the role that kind of the performative nature of victimization and of being public. Here's a funny line. In my humble opinion, Titania writes, joking about pedophilia is even worse than actual pedophilia. Don't get me wrong, an act of physical molestation is obviously abhorrent, but at least it can't be retweeted. What is the kind of role of social media? And I don't even mean to. I don't want to demonize or criticize social media. I love Twitter. I love Instagram.
Do you?
I love
Facebook.
Don't. I do. In a way, I would like to go back to a world where it didn't exist. In the same way, I can kind of remember what the world was like before email, but not really. But I like Twitter. I spend a lot of time. It makes me laugh. It's funny, but it's clear that being able to be circulating in a public way is a big part of that. Can you talk a little bit about that and how what is wrong with that? When you say, like, I hate Twitter, why do you hate it, and why do social justice warriors like it?
Social media generally encourages us to commodify ourselves, to present a certain version of ourselves to the world, and it also rewards the most extreme reactions, which leads to a kind of degradation of political discourse. And this is why I mistrust it. Now, it would be all very well if that was just, on Twitter and that was it, but it isn't, because it seeps into the mainstream.
Right.
We now have major politicians in our country who speak as though they're tweeting. They talk about their opposition, anyone who supports Brexit being Nazis, as David Lammy, the Labour MPs. Actually, David Lammy said that there's a body amongst the Conservative Party called the European Research Group. He actually described them as worse than Nazis. So he described them as Nazis. He was questioned on it. He said, actually, I think they're even worse. That's the level. I mean, that's an elected MP. That's not some idiot. That's some village idiot. This is someone who's actually got clout, talking like a moron. I think largely that comes from, you should read some of his tweets.
Is there not, so this is kind of, 10 or 15 years ago, it was popular to talk about the wisdom of crowds.
Right.
But what you're saying is it's really more the banality of crowds.
Well, no, I do believe in the wisdom of crowds, insofar as I'm a Democrat, and I believe that people are smarter than we think. The people I'm criticizing are actually not part of that. They're part of the elitist circles. I suppose what Twitter does is it elevates the extremes in society so that you think they're more common than they are. This is why when we had the general election, you had, even the night of the election, you had Labour activists thinking they were going to win. They thought that they would unseat Boris Johnson, that he wouldn't even win his own seat. And they were so far off the mark. And the reason was they were only talking to each other.
Yeah, and in the United States, there's a famous kind of instantiation of that in the 1972 presidential election where Richard Nixon beat George McGovern by what at that point was the largest electoral, just total, landslide ever. And a famous New York City film critic named Pauline Kael said she was shocked at that because she didn't know anyone who voted for Nixon.
There we go. Same thing.
So
same thing with Brexit here. Same thing. People were shocked by the result because they just didn't. They didn't talk to anyone.
What about with Twitter or social media allows people to simultaneously broadcast to the world, but also stay in a bubble.
Yeah.
But then there was, it's what happened that a decade ago or a little bit more, we were talking about the. Really the transformative power of social media. Twitter was so embedded in things like the Arab Spring and various Iranian uprisings, not that long ago. Do you think that was always just going to be a small part of what social media was capable of, and that it was really the real potential was in kind of a dumbification of discourse?
Well, I don't think it has made people stupider. I suppose I should be clear about that. I think what I mean is that it's elevated the more stupid aspects of our society. So that's not quite the same thing.
Right.
And it always had the potential to have a kind of democratizing effect insofar that anyone could get there. Anyone could mobilize, as you say, with the Arab Spring, although...
And for me, one of the things that I love about it, and this cuts in all sorts of ways, but when, it allows, I think we're in a broad leveling of power and of discourse so that, and what Twitter does is, when Bill Cosby put out a Twitter feed shortly before he was unmasked as a recidivist, rapist and an assaulter, but he asked people on Twitter to post their favorite pictures of him in sweaters or something, when he was mounting a comeback tour, and it immediately got overtaken by people like, making jokes about him being a rapist,
right?
And it like speeded up his dismissal from decent society.
But my nervousness about that is that can also happen to innocent people,
right?
And it is the sort of place that can foster a genuine kind of witch hunt mentality.
Right.
So that's the element of it. I don't.
So that's. I mean, it definitely cancel culture.
Yeah, is a problem,
and is kind of it's put on steroids by.
Yeah, it is. Now, I'm saying I hate Twitter, but obviously I make a living out of it, but I don't. I just don't. You know what? I think it's just that I like people to be polite to people. I'm really a believer in decorum, and so therefore I'm still endlessly surprised by just how vicious people can be. And
here's another quote that I think illuminates something that you get that you kind of underscore and have a lot of fun with in terms of social justice warriors. Here's a quote from Titania saying, "The conservative broadcaster Ben Shapiro, whose opinions are always wrong, bases much of what he believes on facts, which just goes to show how useless they are. Facts don't care about your feelings," Shapiro is known to say. "The opposite is true. Feelings don't care about your facts. This is how social justice works. If you feel something to be true, then it is true."
But this is exactly why it's worth acknowledging that all of this comes from this postmodernist movement. Because, drawing on, for instance, Roland Barthes and the idea of the death of the author, I mean, people like Derrida and Foucault are saying that actually it's about the interpretation of language, not about the intention.
Of course, Roland Barthes famously run over by a laundry truck that he didn't see coming.
I did not know that.
Yes,
is that right?
That is how he died. He had finished having lunch with George Mitterrand, the future
I'd
president.
never heard this.
Yeah, we won't go into it now. I consider myself a postmodernist.
Right.
I very much believe in the idea that, we do not have access or means to objective truth with a capital T forever and ever. And that I have incredulity toward meta-narratives.
But that's a kind of skepticism that is healthy, I think.
Right. I agree. I would argue that's postmodernism properly understood and defined, but I get what you're saying.
Well, also, I think postmodernism is actually pretty impossible to define. So, I mean,
but to not to get dragged into, my closet and get worked over there.
Yeah.
What you're saying is that in the world we live in now, we do not, is it that we don't share common facts, or we don't even try to petition the people we're debating or we're arguing or we're engaging to have a common set of facts?
I think I wouldn't say we. I think the social justice movement mistrusts the idea of facts. I think they do. Would it make it more comfortable if I don't say postmodernist, but I limit it to the post-structuralists, or if I limit it to the...
Not really, but
okay, fine.
No, well, because what is fascinating to me, I think I get what you're saying. Like consensus, facts. I would argue, that a consensus is always kind of an argument that we've said, okay, it has been won definitively, at least for the time being, by one side. We all agree on, that this table is made of wood, or that wine is red, not white, etc. Yeah. We seem to be in an age now where almost everything is up for grabs.
Right. Well, this is my point, is that when you say there's no such thing as objective truth, that is not to say that you don't take medicine and believe that it will work.
Right.
I mean, even Foucault wasn't saying that things are not true.
Yeah.
He was just suggesting that our means of access to that knowledge is problematized. So the broad point is accurate, that one of the key features of postmodernism was this, not just skepticism of meta-narratives, but I think utter mistrust that there was such a thing as truth or objective truth. And what that means, and with this particular focus that the French coterie had on language, and that there is no reality beyond the discourse with which it is expressed, that means that what you actually end up with is it doesn't matter what people's intention are. It doesn't matter at all, because for a start, these power structures that they talk about in society are sometimes unconscious.
Well, and they are deeply unconscious, and they're embedded in the structure of language,
right, and
which obscures more than it clarifies.
And therefore not driven by individuals, and therefore not driven by intent.
Right.
Right. But actually, when it comes to something like racism, intent is key for me. I think someone who inadvertently says something racist hasn't said something racist, as far as I'm concerned. So I think that's I mean, you saw it today. Did you see so there's a man in the UK, a famous newsreader called Alistair Stewart.
You know, the only famous newsreader from the BBC or from England I like is David Icke's, I guess, the reptile guy.
David Icke.
Yeah, David Icke.
David Icke, yeah. Well, he believes that the royal family are lizards, so perhaps we shouldn't go down that role.
No, there's a reason why Meghan, and hopefully we'll get to that, and Prince Harry had to leave. Yeah.
But this guy, Alistair Stewart, so what happened was he got into an argument on Twitter with a man who happened to be black. And he tweeted at this man a quotation from Shakespeare's Measure for Measure, which is about the folly of humankind in which the word ape is used. But of course, it's absolutely not a racial slur. And this is now, he's had to stand down from his job. It's been taken as it's obviously not racist, right? He even used that exact same quotation. It's like a thing he's done before to white people on Twitter. It hasn't even crossed his mind. And of course, now the weird thing is that the ones who are seeing the word ape in a Shakespeare quotation and their minds jump to black person, they're the ones who are complaining about racism. But of course, that thought process is the racist thought process.
Do you think we are in a, it's the idea of feeling and of rage,
right?
Rage, barely contained rage or uncontained rage and emotionalism is a hallmark of social justice in many ways.
Absolutely. It
is. Is that on the rise, or is it just that, social justice warriors or people have realized like this is a pretty, it's not a rational tool of persuasion, but it's a very effective tool of persuasion.
It's not an effective tool of persuasion.
So talk about that a little bit.
I think
is it not over time, but it's like when if somebody breaks down and cries, if somebody shakes with rage, Greta Thunberg, one of, part of her appeal is when she really gets lit up in like, she's outraged and she's crying and she's screaming at people.
It doesn't have a rhetorical effect. It doesn't persuade anyone. It has an intimidatory effect.
Okay.
So the idea, if you collectively intimidate people into thinking that they cannot express certain viewpoints, which is what is happening with the social justice movement, yes, it is effective insofar as I suppose you win the short-term battle, but you haven't persuaded anyone. All that's happened is people are keeping their views to themselves. That's not the same thing. If they actually cared about persuasion, then they would realize that rhetoric is more important. By rhetoric, I mean the ancient art of persuasion. I mean the engaging with people in a polite way. Screaming at them never persuades anyone, but it does encourage people to shut up for fear of being ostracized.
At one point, Titania writes, "If you don't want to be censored, don't say the wrong things." It really is that simple.
And it is that simple, right? But then, of course, the wrong things change according to time and context. So what I will love, in fact, is that, in about 20 years' time, when the social justice movement is the wrong thing, and how are they going to cope when they are suddenly considered offensive? I mean, there's all sorts of things that the people within...
And that always happens.
Yeah, it always happens, right?
I'm really yesterday's Maverick. And I guess this comes up with people, in a UK context, she's certainly better known there than in the US, but somebody like Germaine Greer.
Right, exactly.
Who 30 or 40 years ago was... oh my God, she was such a radical, and now she is a
hideous
reactionary, Gorgon, right?
I'm looking forward to it. I might not be alive, but if I do live long enough to see it, it will be interesting to see when. I mean, I'm actually trying to anticipate what are the things that the social justice movement do at the moment that in 20, 30 years' time will be considered beyond the pale. I think their ageism will obviously be on the pale. Like that's almost already happening. They hate old people.
Why do they hate old people?
Well, they think the elderly have fucked over the planet through their climate issues. They also think they voted for Brexit and therefore they're all racists. But they are flagrantly ageist in a really funny way. They also hate the working class. So similarly for things like Brexit, because so many working class people supported Boris Johnson, even the traditional Labour voters, right? So, but all of their own prejudices will come out. The other thing is, of course, is the young generation are really sick of the social justice movement, the Generation Z, or you could say Z, because you don't speak properly, but the Generation Z that have a real issue with the social justice movement and will almost certainly be rebelling against it. When I do talks at universities, the majority of those kids are sick to death of it. It's just it's the minority of kids that go into student politics that have so much
that
clout.
Leads to the question: how does Titania die, both figuratively and literally?
I wondered about that. How am I going to kill her off? I think literally she's going to be banned from Twitter at some point. I have absolutely no doubt about that.
Yeah, and in a way, she is inspired by Godfrey Elfwick. Is it Elfwick or Elwick?
Elfwick.
Elfwick.
Yeah.
Who was a previous, kind of super woke, multi pansexual character.
He was a genderqueer Muslim atheist.
Yes. And who got banned from Twitter, right?
To the extent that whenever it was a friend of mine, Lisa, who was running the account at that point, tried to come back, he would be banned within days on the basis of the name alone, you know? So, it would be a different device, it would be a different IP address, but he'd still get banned.
Do you worry that the media, kind of the means of distribution for, satire as well as, all sorts of information, do you worry about that being controlled for the long haul by either social justice warriors or by
hugely,
state, government actors and corporate power that just wants to dictate
this
terms?
Is the real problem, because although the vast majority of people are against the social justice movement, well, when I say that, let's be absolutely clear. Most people, I'm talking about the UK here, most people in the UK are anti-racist, sort of actively anti-racist. We just don't like it as a country, and we don't like homophobia, and we don't like, all of these battles have been won. And when I say they've been won, that's not to suggest that there is no such thing as racism or homophobia in the country. What I'm saying is, to be racist or homophobic in the UK today is to make yourself a pariah. So that's all been won. But the social justice movement don't see it that way, and they want to kind of brand people as these things. And most people are sick of it. But unfortunately, they're also predominant in those key areas that affect the direction of culture. So the media, arts, journalism, like I say, all these sort of major areas, HR departments, human resources departments, government quangos, such as the Advertising Standards Authority, which decide to ban adverts if they perpetuate gender stereotypes, do ridiculous things like this. They have way too much power for such a few. It's really bad. And that's why we need to, Silicon Valley, the tech giants, Google, Facebook, it's overrun by these people, and they're not representative of enlightened thought.
Have you looked at all how this kind of intersects with, overtly authoritarian governments such as China?
Yeah.
Because, they must be looking at all of this and wondering what the fuck is going on, but then also, they're seeing different ways that they can kind of structure conversations and control them. I
think it's really important when you use the word authoritarian is to really clarify, we do not live in an authoritarian state, but it's surprising how often social justice activists will deploy the tactics of authoritarian states, and cancel culture is part of that. And I think that's what makes me nervous, and certainly the fact that they have such a dismissive attitude towards free speech. There's certainly authoritarian echoes there. I think the way I like to describe it is a kind of creeping authoritarianism. It happens piecemeal. It's not something that happens overnight, and it's no one's getting dragged off to the gulag, right?
Right.
And even in the terms of cancel culture, no one's been cancelled as in disappeared as they would, for instance, in Saddam Hussein's Iraq.
Right.
It's not actual cancellation. But, to have your livelihood ruined and your reputation trashed is a there are echoes there. And it is a form of bullying that we need to be vigilant about.
Is the way out of that, is it the kind of Ricky Gervais model where you just say, I don't give a shit? And
it would be, but Ricky Gervais doesn't have to give a shit because he's in a position of power, and he would be the first to admit that. He can say what, and thank God for him actually, because he says what he wants. He doesn't have a boss. He's not going to get fired. My concern is not the people like Ricky Gervais and Dave Chappelle say, the people who can say what they want and they don't have to worry. It's the people who can't. It's the people who work in normal jobs who are concerned about what they are saying and policing their own language for fear of retribution.
What, I think you've answered this, but let me ask it starkly. What do you hope to accomplish with the Titania McGrath persona and the spoof and the satire? The book, you're working on a children's book that she'll be producing. When is that supposed to come out?
I have finished the children's book. It's called My First Little Book of Intersectional Activism. Probably going to be out in a couple of months. So the idea of that book is that there's so many of these woke children's books at the moment. There's one of the best-selling children's books last year was the book Goodnight Stories for Rebel Girls, which is a chapter by chapter goes through feminist icons of the history. There's a book called C is for Consent. There's a book called Feminist Baby, The Little Girl Who Gave Zero Fucks. These books are hugely popular, but they are shamelessly propagandizing and incredibly blatant in their indoctrination and really funny as a result. You read them and you just think, you're not even trying to conceal this anymore. It's not subtle. It's funny. It's any kind of proselytizing cult.
Right.
It's just that they've gone mainstream and they can do this now. So I thought Titania would write a book because she wants children to,
Will she have children?
No.
She can't have children because she would not bring them into this world, or she would not have sex with a man.
She wouldn't have sex with a man because that would be appeasing the patriarchy.
Is she into kind of like techno-feminism? Could she have a surrogate or
No, because she believes that the act of reproduction is in itself heteronormative.
I see.
In fact, she's sort of pro-infanticide. So I don't think she would. No, she thinks King Herod had the right idea.
All right. Yeah, he just didn't go far enough.
He didn't go far enough.
Yeah.
She thinks that, heterosexuality is a disease. She thinks that future generations will thank us if we eliminate heterosexuality. So she's a nihilist.
It's not exactly clear where future generations will come from, but they will thank us.
Quite.
Yes.
Yeah.
Let's talk about your own byline. But before we get there, is it at all ironic that Titania may be, with 400,000 and change Twitter followers, she may be the most famous woke person on the planet?
I find that you might be right, but I find that very difficult to process. I think that's...
Is it? Yeah, I mean, because is it in, skip forward 5 or 10 years and, there's been some kind of rift in time and space, and the only thing, we're all dead, but Titania exists on Twitter and people just take her seriously.
I would love that. That would be the ultimate troll. If future generations, if everything got wiped out and they found her Twitter feed and they thought that that's the way that our society was run, that would be, I would love that. She'd be like a god. That'd be wonderful.
So the work that appears under the name of Andrew Doyle, you write at Spiked, you write at The Spectator, you perform, and you were part of Jonathan Pie. Can you explain what that was? Because that was kind of an internet sensation.
Jonathan Pie was a character. How do you explain it? Like, if you when you've got a news reporter reporting the news, obviously. The idea of the character was that you sort of see what happens when the camera's not on the news reporter. And this particular Jonathan Pie is a very kind of ranting lefty, hates Trump, hates the Tories, and gets very angry and cannot stop himself from getting angry. And that was the idea, which works. That's why some people, when they see the video, they think it's real once you've seen it once or twice. After you've seen it a couple of times, then you've seen it all, because it goes on and on. It does the same thing multiple times. And I co-wrote that for 3 years. And what's interesting about that experience is, one of the videos in particular went viral in America, and it was just after Donald Trump was elected. I don't know if you saw it. And basically, Jonathan was screaming about how it's all Hillary's fault and how the left needs to reflect. Of course, that didn't happen, did it? So that became quite big in America. It got something like 150 million views totally. Wow. It was insane. But what I learned from that is I got a lot of flack from that, from the right. From the left and the right, actually. I started getting it from both sides. Jonathan Pie, generally, because he was attacking the right all the time, I've had the right-wingers angry at me. Right. I've seen what that looks like. And then doing Titania, I've had the left angry with me, and I've seen what that looks like. And having had it from both sides, I have to say the leftist activists are by far the most vitriolic and vicious, by far. And that, I think, is odd. I don't know what, that's sort of counterintuitive. It's like, do you remember when Marianne Williams was caught on that hot mic and she said, I'm a lefty, but my God, they're mean. Yeah. She said they're really mean. And it's, and of course, you because you associate leftism with tolerance and standing up for people and actually the reality of it is that the activists on that side are by far the most bullying and awful. One
of the piece that you wrote for Spiked, I guess last fall, was an appreciation of the TV show Friends. And Friends is one of these shows which was a massive kind of multi-year cultural moment. It remains super popular now because it's on Netflix, and whole generations who did not watch it on TV are watching it in effectively what would have been called reruns.
Yeah.
And you noted, I guess it was the 10th or 20th year of some anniversary of Friends. It was attacked by a lot of people for being, just about thin, white, kind of wealthy people.
Yeah.
You made a case that Friends was actually a transgressive show. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I think it's deeply transgressive. I've always loved Friends. I think it's a great show. And I think part of the reason by the way, I should say the media in the UK have really tried to spin this idea that millennials and Generation Z hate Friends and they're all offended by it. They're not. 2 or 3 people tweeted about it. That's all that is. the success of Friends on Netflix proves that actually the younger generation love it, and that it's one of those comedies that hasn't aged very much, which is really great. There are certain jokes in it that they wouldn't do now, but no, it really worked. I think, and partly the reason I think it works is because it is so transgressive. My view of that is that it started out as being a very schmaltzy, saccharine TV show, and you've got the fun kind of kooky musician in the form of Phoebe. You've got Monica, who likes things a bit clean. You've got Jennifer Aniston playing Rachel, who's very spoiled, and so you've got those, and it's very sweet. And they didn't shy away from the sentimental. By the time you get to series 5, they exaggerate all the characters to an extent that they become these kind of monstrous caricatures. So you have Phoebe suddenly stops being kooky. Suddenly we learn that she stabbed a cop. She tells Monica to get out of the way one time because she's going to cut her. You've got Ross who wants to have sex with his cousin. You've got Monica catching Chandler and thinking he masturbates to sharks. You've got this very dark stuff that goes on. And it's even more effective because the image of the show is about sentimentality and schmaltz. And so therefore you don't see quite how subversive this is. I think the example of Monica and Chandler, that we saw a lot of their, the proposal scene where there's lots of candles and it's very, very, it's very sentimental. And then as soon as they're married, that you realize they don't really like each other that much, and they just want to get married for the free stuff. And this was another point I made in the article. All of those so-called friends lie to each other all the time. The first instinct they have is to lie to get out of trouble all the time. Right. So for me, the title of the show, Friends, is ironic. They're not really. And so to me, that's quite interesting.
So another piece that you wrote that I thought was really interesting, again from Spiked, was called The Religion of Intersectionality, How the Social Justice Movement Became a Self-Defeating Cult of Victimhood. And it goes over some of the things that we talked about in a slightly different context. But it's kind of a sympathetic rendering of Kimberly Crenshaw's intersectionality. She's the feminist legal scholar who coined the term intersectionality.
Yes.
And you don't really think intersectionality is wrong per se, which is the idea that different people can have multiple layers of kind of oppression or negativity applied to them, that a black female lesbian is probably worse off than simply a black woman or a lesbian or a woman or a white person. So can you talk a little bit about that and then discuss the turn that just kind of screws things
up?
Well,
I think she had a point. I think and she was very specifically rooting it in the case of General Motors. And in that case, what happened was that the General Motors were taken to court because black women felt that they were being discriminated against. And their defense was that we are not racist because, look, we have all these black men working for us. And we're not sexist because we have all these white women working for us. So, of course, you get this situation where the black women are falling through the cracks. And she was absolutely right to take them to task for that. And it's, of course, perfectly true that people can, she described it as, it's an analogy really, she described it as this image of standing at the intersection like a crossroads where you can be hit by from various directions. It's a handy analogy. And the point I make in the article is I think that's where its utility ends. And it's kind of become this kind of cultish idea so that now we automatically assume there's this thing called white privilege, right? Mm-hmm. And we assume that therefore we tend to put things into an hierarchy so that you have like, okay, a black woman is this level of the hierarchy, black lesbians even higher, trans black lesbians even higher. And it's like, but that's not necessarily the case because that doesn't take into account the individual circumstances. I know black lesbians who are much more privileged than white straight men, right? So
and this is, of course, and you were talking about this, if you don't bring up class at all, then you're missing a major kind of power struggle.
Well, a lot of intersectionalists would say that they do take note of class, but not. My concern is that more often than not, they don't. Right. And not only that, that often class is complete. In fact, race, gender, and sexuality is used as a means to avoid the class discussion.
Right. You conclude that article by saying to define individuals principally through their group identity is a degrading approach that has divisive consequences for humanity.
Right.
The best that we can do is to attempt to redress all forms of injustice as and when we encounter them.
Yeah.
Do you get a lot of drinks thrown in your face when you trot that out?
Well, look, I think I'm right about that. I think we should be addressing injustice as and when we see it, not as and when we imagine it. I suppose that's the point I'm trying to make.
So then what are you, you've mentioned that you consider yourself a socialist. What does that mean? And
Well, I don't know if I do. I think the reason I say that is because I know that some of my principles and some of my views on certainly economic policy would happen to fall in line with the socialist mindset, right?
Yeah.
That doesn't make me a socialist because I wouldn't subscribe to everything. I see myself as very much more, how can you put it, social liberal, I suppose. But not wedded to that particularly. I mean,
Do you consider yourself more of an individualist?
I just take things as they come. I just take issues as they come, and I think about each individual issue, and I make a decision on and sometimes I'm wrong.
What are the big issues that still, or problems that need to be addressed? Do you think? Because you say we're not living in a utopia, but there's no question that things are better for more types of people all over the world, but certainly in Western or in Europe and North America.
Undeniably. And that, this is something I'm still trying to work out. When people call me right wing, they think it's an insult, and I don't think it's an insult. I don't think it's accurate, but I don't think it's an insult because I don't think there's anything wrong with being right wing. But I think, too often the problem is that people will say that right wingers, people who believe in free market, are evil and they want the poor to suffer. Well, of course, a free market, a good faith interpretation of a free market argument is actually the more wealth that we develop, the better it will be for the poor, right? So I'm willing to be persuaded on this. I think the evidence seems to be suggesting that capitalism is good for poor people ultimately. But by the same token, I don't think that necessarily means that the super rich shouldn't be taxed proportionately for what they earn. I think those things can exist side by side. Why does it have to be a black and white situation one way or the other? So I'm still wanting to discuss these issues and decide where I'm sitting. But I would have to agree with you that objectively speaking, things have got better for most people in terms of the world, in terms of poverty, and a lot of that has been largely driven by capitalism.
We are going to leave it there. I want to thank Andrew Doyle for talking to Reason. Andrew, thank you. Andrew is also perhaps better known as Titania McGrath. Follow him on Twitter at, what is your actual Twitter handle?
What, as in Andrew's?
Yeah.
Oh, God, I'm talking about it myself in the third person.
There you go.
Oh, that's a disaster. That is AndrewDoyle_com.
Okay.
The Twitter handle,
and then also at Titania McGrath. There's links on the page if you're listening to this. The new book from Titania McGrath is Woke. And look for a children's book coming out soon. This has been The Reason Interview with Nick Gillespie. Please subscribe to us at reason.com/podcast. You can also go to Apple, Google, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. But do subscribe and rate and review us if you so choose. That would be wonderful. Thanks for listening.